Hi, I'm Sharp Whitebeard here with another video. What I wanted to talk about today is pirate history. What most people, when they think about pirates, they think about the golden age of pirates, the Pirates of the Caribbean, which was an era that happened between the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s in the Caribbean. And how this whole thing came about, if you read your history, is back then the Caribbean was called basically the Spanish Lake. It was called Spanish America. Some of the main islands there were Hispaniola. There was a chain of islands called the West Indies. And it was a very wealthy, lucrative area at the time. A lot of economic power there. And the main powers in Europe, you're looking at England, France, Holland, and Spain, were fighting for power there in the Caribbean at the time. There was a series of wars they carried out, naval battles and stuff between each other for that era. In that era, what happened was a lot of the ships would come out of Europe and they'd sail to Africa, and they basically would bring what they would trade with them to trade with the natives was wine, weapons, arms, and cloth, textiles, different types of cloth. And they would trade that to the natives that were there, and what they wanted was gold, ivory, and slaves. What they would do is they'd take their cargo, they'd trade the cargo off and take the cargo they're bringing back, and they would sail down to the Caribbean. And the Caribbean, what their wealth was derived from was basically tobacco, rum, and coffee. Rum was made from the sugar cane back then, and so you had these tobacco plantations, you had these coffee plantations and sugarcane plantations. So the Caribbean, these plantations down there, they needed a constant supply of physical labor to work there. And most of the laborers that they brought in were considered, they used to work them to death, they were considered replaceable. So they would work them to death, replace them. They wanted a constant flow of labor coming in. What they had the slaves from Africa they would use, and there was men and women they brought over. There were the natives, the indigenous people that were there. A lot of times they were enslaved and pressed into labor, men and women both. And there was also indentured servants from Europe that they would bring in. And they were, basically, petty criminals, outlaws, disenfranchised types, sometimes to no fault of their own. They're rounded up in the main cities in Europe, and they were brought, and they put on ships and brought over to the colonies to be used as laborers. And the indentured servants were white European folks, and they would usually have like a contract of 7 years. So they would bring them into the colonies. The colonies somebody would buy their contract, usually the plantation owners would buy their contract for 7 years. And the people were forced to work as slaves for 7 years until they worked off their debt or their contract, whatever you want to call it. And then they were given their freedom, which at the time they were basically, most of them were never allowed to go back to Europe. They had to stay there as colonists. So they weren't real happy either. They weren't treated very well either. Then of course the sailors that sailed off to Africa and then came back towards the Caribbean, they weren't treated very well either. They needed a big crew when they set sail for Africa to load up the cargo and everything else and do all this stuff. But once they had the cargo secure, heading back to the Caribbean, they really didn't need that many sailors anymore. And at that point, once they got to the Caribbean, they owed them probably like over a year's pay, back pay for these guys. And a lot of the conditions are so harsh and so bad, and there's all kinds of stories about that at the time. There was somebody wrote that nobody would sign on a ship if you had the good sense to get thrown in prison. They said the food was better, the company was better, and you didn't have the chance of drowning. And back then, prisons were pretty bad too. So what does that tell you? So the sailors are pretty fed up by the time they hit the Caribbean, and a lot of them would jump ship. They thought that the Caribbean was a paradise. There was beaches, there was fish. You could hunt, do whatever. You try to live by yourself and not be under authority. So a lot of the professional sailors at that time, they were professional sailors by that point, they jumped ship and they ran off into the jungles and stuff. And a lot of the people, the slaves and stuff, they would run off from the plantations, and they'd run off and run into the jungles and meet up with these folks, and all these groups would kind of band together and form their own societies and their own subcultures. And what they would do is they set up some strongholds. There's Port Nassau, there was Tortuga, there's Port Royal, some of the strongholds the pirates would come into, and they would start to basically form their own societies. The powers that be at the time, England, France, Holland, and Spain, were fighting each other at the time, so they didn't have the resources or the inclination to subdue these pirates at the time, so they kind of run amok. The pirates kind of ran amok, and basically there was the buccaneers and there was privateers. Some of them, the buccaneers, were the people that ran off into the jungle, and they would hunt wild boar and wild pigs in the jungles, and then they would smoke the meat, sell them to passerbyers at the ships. And they're mostly young people, young folks, trying to survive. The privateers were sailors that sent on to ships that were given letters of marque, that they were allowed to pirate other ships than what the country that gave them the letters of marque. So if England gave you letters of marque, you can attack France and Spain and whatever, as long as they were at war with them, and it was okay, according to England and whatever you had. And the buccaneers would start realizing they could just attack these ships and rob them instead of settling for the crumbs off the table of these people in power. And that's basically these disenfranchised people from all groups forming the pirate culture, and were able to get away with it and run them up for about 30 years or so, until they finally, the main powers had peace, and then they were able to decide that they wanted to go ahead and wipe out and do away with the pirate situation in the Caribbean. So that's pretty much the groundwork for how this whole thing happened in history.